Hello everyone and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. Thanks once again to all our Patreon subscribers who are making this podcast possible. Your patronage really is much appreciated by Angus and myself. I will give a shout out to new patrons who have joined since the last episode at the start of episode 7 after the next couple of episodes, as I'm recording these a little ahead of schedule due to other diary commitments. As ever though, if you've become a patron previously and haven't had me mention you and would like me to, then just drop me a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, and I will make sure I correct that. If you're not a patron yet and would like to find out more, then please go along to patreon.com/The History Network, and Angus and I tell you all about it there. Thank you. The historynetwork.org podcast, season 26, episode 5, The Spanish Invasion and Conquest of Mexico, 1519 to 1521, part 1. This episode has been written by Paul Seaman. Paul studied medieval and modern history at the Royal Holloway University in London, then went into teaching, completing several postgraduate qualifications, including a master's. He is now a primary national leader of education based in Norfolk, UK. He spends his time between work, family, and indulging his passion for military history, primarily through wargaming with the new Buckingham Historical Wargamers. As many of you know, Paul has written for us before, so thanks once again, Paul, for this great two-parter. The conquest of Mexico was a landmark in the history of the world, changing its course forever. A mere 600 adventurers, speculators and journeymen from a European nation that had only existed in its current form for a few decades landed in an unknown land and proceeded to conquer a massive, ruthless and predatory empire in the space of just a few years. The military and political achievement of the conquistadors surely ranks as one of the most incredible military expeditions in history, and in leading it, the failed law student Hernan Cortes secured himself a name as one of the most famous generals of all time. The conquest and the later campaigns across what would become known as South and Central America established European dominance of the New World and the subjugation of its native peoples. This, of course, coincided with many controversial decisions which would be unacceptable by today's standards, but nevertheless, while Britain and its successor states, the USA and Canada, came to dominate the north of the continent, it was Spain that largely dominated the south and central areas. Indeed, several states in the US, such as Texas, New Mexico and California, retained strong links to their Spanish roots, English and Spanish being often still spoken side by side in the southwest US. Christopher Columbus had discovered the New World, but it was Hernan Cortes and his conquistadors who set about exploiting it. The two sides could not have been more different, be that technologically, culturally, politically, or socially. Spain had only just emerged from 3/4 of a millennia of constant warfare with the Moors. In 1492, eventually reconquering Grenada, the last centre of Islamic rule on the Iberian Peninsula. Indeed, the notion of Spain was more of an idea than a reality. Castile, Aragon and Portugal were 3 separate entities, and the main powers on the peninsula, the latter 2 being joined by the marriage of Isabel and Ferdinand in 1469. The 1490s and 1500s were a time of great change for the Spanish. The discovery of the New World was something that proved hard for the Spanish and other Europeans to explain. The peoples of the New World were so different to themselves that, in the thinking of the day, heavily influenced by the Church, they could not fathom if these peoples were the creation of God or Satan. Various small settlements in the Caribbean and subsequent expeditions onto the coasts of Yucatan, Florida and Campeche reported tales of huge cities and flourishing civilizations, which prompted the Spanish governor of Cuba, Velázquez, to commission another expedition into the interior, which would be led by Cortés himself. The Aztecs, or Mexicans as they called themselves, were a truly mighty civilization and the successors of a series of peoples that had lived in central Mexico for well over 1,000 years. Centered on the great city of Tenochtitlan, adjacent city-states were tied to Mexico through treaties, while numerous smaller states beyond were self-governing but forced to submit to Mexico's overlordship through a well-practiced implementation of terror tactics. They paid regular tribute and submitted to Tenochtitlan's demands. The Aztecs themselves were not originally from the central Mexican plateau, instead moving into the area from lands to the northwest, driven by a prophecy that they were a chosen people being led by their god Huitzilopochtli to a promised land. Tenochtitlan itself was established in 1325, following a vision of an eagle resting on a cactus, fulfilling that prophecy. It was here they settled. Later, similar prophecies within the Aztec culture were to play a massive part in the outcome of the conquistador expedition. From 1428, the Aztecs formed the Triple Alliance with the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan and came to dominate the area, with these original allies gradually becoming semi-client states over the next century. Tenochtitlan, or the City of Mexico, became the center of a trading network that ran across most of Central America. It grew wealthy and powerful. Its leaders became the Caesars of this new empire. The Mexicans' main rivals were the Tlaxcalans to their east, and a state of constant tension existed between the two, often breaking into skirmishes or open battles. The nature of battles in this time was also very different to European experiences. While men were killed, as in any war, there was a cultural imperative on both sides to acquire captives for offer as sacrifices to the gods. These men were deemed as chosen ones and would go directly to paradise. Dying in this manner was seen as a fortunate and blessed death. Human sacrifice was the main cultural tenement to Mexican religious beliefs. Without this, they believed the gods would choose for their time to be at an end on this world. As a result, innumerable people, from captives, human tributes, or children of the poor, had their still beating hearts removed on the temples each year. Without human blood, the blood of the gods would be depleted and the world would end. Wars called flower wars were fought by arrangement between the two sides, with the sole purpose of replenishing captive stocks for the temples. One report suggests that in 1487, 80,400 captives were sacrificed at the dedication of the Great Temple. The contrast to the message of Christianity was striking for the Europeans who encountered this. Again, however, these Mexican beliefs, focusing on an almost inevitable impending doom, also played a significant role in the success of the conquest. Technologically, there was also a huge contrast. The conquistadors came with steel weapons and armour, horses and gunpowder. Facing them, the Aztecs relied on wooden clubs, spears and arrows, indented with razor-sharp pieces of obsidian. One of these, the maquawitch, was wielded much like a sword, but still was fundamentally a large piece of wood with obsidian edges. Protecting the Aztec warriors were quilted cotton jerkins, thick enough to withstand an arrow, wooden shields overlaid with feathers, and for the warriors of higher rank, elaborately decorated feather suits in the styles of, for example, jaguars and eagles. Helmets were carved wood or bone, usually also in the style of an animal head. These suits were designed not just to protect the wearer, but also to intimidate the enemy. As such, when the conquistadors saw their enemy and finally joined battle with the Aztecs, they saw on one side a rigidity in approach that was unable to adjust to the European tactics and objectives, still intent on taking captives to the very end, while on the other, the Spanish, who no longer fought for conquest, land or gold, but rather for the very salvation of their souls, knowing full well what fate would befall them were they to be captured. In preparation for the expedition, Cortes fell out with the governor, Velasquez, who thought correctly that Cortes was implementing his own agenda. Cortes left in spite of the governor's wishes. When Cortes's fleet left San Cristobal on February the 10th, 1519, it consisted of 11 vessels, 530 Europeans, several hundred West Indian natives and Africans, and about 8 European women. There were also 16 horses, an animal never before seen on the American mainland, and a considerable number of large mastiffs and wolfhounds, or war dogs. On their journey they also picked up a former shipwrecked Andalusian cleric in Geronimo de Aguiar, who brought with him several years of living amongst the Maya and spoke fluent Chontol Maya. Cortes's first main stop was at the town of Pontonchan on the North Yucatan coast. Here the conquistadors fought their first pitched battle, and while the natives fought very fiercely, the experience of a cavalry charge by Cortes's horse routed them. However, the ferocity with which the native peoples fought convinced Cortes that his small force would not be enough to conquer the mainland peoples, and instead turned to other tactics. He told the local chiefs that if they became vassals of the Spanish crown, as he was, he would protect them. The alternative was that the artillery, which he portrayed as alive, would jump up and kill them. A cannon was fired, a horse, an alien creature to them, began to paw and buck, and the chiefs, terrified, submitted. The next day gold, cloth, and women were sent to Cortes's camp as gifts. The sight of gold prompted Cortes to inquire as to its source. Mexico was the reply, which now ensured the conquistadors were more determined to see the city for themselves. One of the women gifted to Cortes could speak both Nahuatl and Chontol, so with the native speakers already in Cortes's camp, she became his ears and mouth in dealing with the natives. She was given the name Donna Marina. She also became Cortes's mistress and was to bear him a son. Cortes's fleet set sail again, moving further up the coast and landing in an area controlled by the Totonacs, one of the Mexican vassal states. Cortes struck up relations with the local governors, inviting them on board his ship for dinner and reassuring them he was there only to trade and explore. Soon the local representative of the Aztecs, a man named Teotili, arrived with gifts of gold and textiles. Cortes returned the favour with gifts of his own and a spectacle of horsemanship and artillery. He commented how he was keen to see Tenochtitlan and meet Emperor Moctezuma. He was told this was impossible, but yet more gifts arrived in the form of yet more gold. These only served to make the conquistadors more determined to see this wonderful city for themselves. Cortes's situation came to a head. The force he had assembled was split in what to do next. Some supported the governor of Cuba and believed they should now return and report what they had found. Others saw little point in going back, but scented great riches if they continued on. If he returned to Cuba, Cortes would be imprisoned, at best for leaving in defiance of the governor. To continue on his own would make him a traitor. His brief but unsuccessful experience with the law gave him his answer. He resigned his commission from Velasquez, persuaded his men to form their own government in their garrison/settlement at Villarica, and petitioned the king to recognise it as a colony. To assist in persuading the king in this decision, all treasure collected to that date was inventoried and sent back to Spain with Cortes's representatives. At the same time, Cortes was visited by a delegation of Totonacs who seemed on the verge of open rebellion against the Mexicans. Cortes took most of his small force and marched to the main Totonac city of Cempoala, where for the first time they witnessed both the impressive beauty of the architecture and the horrors of human sacrifice. Soon Mexican representatives demanded additional captives to the usual tribute as payment for the Spanish being received with authorization. Cortes, in a massive gamble, persuaded the Totonacs to arrest the representatives, flog them, but then allowed them to escape to pass news of the rebellion to Tenochtitlan. Cortes also ordered the temple pulled down and used the threat of his military power to imprison the leaders. The Totonacs were now committed to the Spanish objectives, whether they wanted to be or not. Meanwhile, the Velasquez faction in Cortes's camp were plotting to return to Cuba. Cortes hanged one of their leaders and then scuttled his fleet. The conquistadors, in a short space of time, had been given an ultimatum: conquer or die. Marching further into the interior, Cortes approached the Tlaxcala, the enemies of the Mexicans, and a people the Totonacs recommended would be useful allies against them. Initially there were several battles with the Tlaxcalans, but the European approach to warfare was a marked change for them, and unnerved they settled for peace, with an apology and an explanation that they thought Cortes was allied with the Mexicans. Tlaxcala was surrounded on all sides. One of the reasons the Mexicans tolerated the Tlaxcalans was that the conflict with them served as a training ground for Mexican warriors and a source of captives from the Flower Wars. As a result, Tlaxcalan warriors were well trained and numerous. Cortes nurtured friendship with the Tlaxcalans. This would prove to be the key decision in the conquest of Mexico. After 20 days in Tlaxcala, Cortes was persuaded to travel the additional 30 miles to the city of Cholula, another wealthy state allied to Mexico. There he was told by emissaries from the Aztecs he would find out if he were to meet Moctezuma or not. Despite his Tlaxcalan allies warning him against the journey, Cortes and the conquistadors with several thousand native auxiliaries made the journey. They were welcomed by the Cholulans initially, although they soon became more frosty. Visits from local dignitaries reduced, and local crowds began to mock and deride the Spanish. Through the ever-present Donna Maria and Tlaxcalan intelligence, they learned that there was a plan to massacre the conquistadors. Cortes summoned the Cholulan leaders, who were promptly surrounded, and confessed to the trap. Cortes gave the signal. In a well-prepared plan, the conquistador and Totonac auxiliaries fell upon the Cholulan guards and then moved through the city in vicious house-to-house fighting, slaughtering any warrior or potential warrior they found. The main temple in the city was set ablaze, killing the Cholulan priests inside. Cortes estimated over 3,000 men were killed in the first 2 hours. Soon after, the Tlaxcalans were invited into the city for 2 days of further pillage and slaughter. The news of the ambush and massacre shocked Moctezuma. Seemingly relenting to Cortes's demands, he sent more lavish gifts and also a double who could pass himself off as the emperor to Cortes. Conquistador scouts located the city of Tenochtitlan and reported that they had seen another new world of large cities and towers, and a sea, and in that sea a very large city, which indeed seemed frightening and awesome. This, of course, was the Aztec capital on Lake Texcoco. As the conquistadors made their way towards the city, they passed through several more subsidiary provinces whose leaders complained of Aztec oppression. Soon other smaller allies joined Cortes's warning him about not trusting Moctezuma. These allies were also able to identify the Moctezuma double as not being the real emperor. In a final attempt to ward off the Castillans, Moctezuma gathered his finest sorcerers and necromancers and sent them to cast spells towards Cortes and his allies. However, they soon returned to the emperor, claiming that they had seen a vision of their god, Tezcatlipoca, chief of all their gods, who had told them that Mexico was doomed. As such, Moctezuma prepared to receive Cortes in Tenochtitlan in the belief that his gods had abandoned him. And so it was on the 8th of November 1519 that Moctezuma met Cortes on the great Iztapalapa causeway, which led into the city. Cacama, the king of Texcoco, arrived and, along with Moctezuma's brother Cuitlahuac, flanked the emperor. Hundreds of other princes formed the entourage. The lake was filled with canoes, buildings, and the causeway itself was filled with people who had come to witness this occasion. To the Aztecs, Cortes seemed like a visitor from another world, perhaps even a god. Cortes had but 400 of his Castilian soldiers accompanying him. The Mexican people, even the princes, averted their eyes so as not to look at Moctezuma, and indicated to Cortes that an embrace was not appropriate. Nevertheless, Cortes was permitted to take a necklace from his own neck made of glass beads and pearls and scented with musk, and place it around the emperor's neck. In return, Moctezuma gave Cortes a necklace made of red snail shells and golden shrimp, and personally placed it around Cortes's neck, a deed in itself which shocked the Aztecs. After an exchange of greetings, the Castilians were shown to their quarters in the palace of Moctezuma's father, Axayacatl, just off the main plaza in the city. They were housed and well fed, often feasting with the emperor, trying wonderful new foods such as chocolate and chilies, being entertained by dancers and acrobats, and experiencing new things such as smoking after dinner and visiting the menagerie with the beautiful native animals such as the quetzal bird, jaguars, and the first sighting of a rattlesnake by any European. They witnessed the horrors of the great temple, with idols covered in blood to a depth of several centimetres, and the towers made of the heads of the sacrificial victims, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They visited the trading capital of the empire, Tlatelolco, with a vast square of 500 square feet and full of 20 to 40,000 people trading, and another great temple with its caverns of thick clotted blood. Here an exchange between Cortes and Moctezuma indicated the raft of difference between the two cultures. Cortes insisted that these were not gods, but demons, and requested that a cross be placed on the top and a statue of the Virgin Mary placed within the sanctuary. Moctezuma and his priests took great offence, argued that the gods were good as they brought the rains and harvest and victories. The two men parted company, Cortes returning to Tenochtitlan, while Moctezuma remained and sacrificed more victims to apologize to the gods for Cortes's disrespect. Nevertheless, the Aztecs were less judgmental about the Christian god and allowed the Spanish to have a small chapel in their quarters. Here, finding a bricked-up doorway, Cortes and his men forced it open, finding a chamber with hoards of wealth within. Taking note, the door was again bricked up and sealed, so the Aztecs were not to be aware of its discovery. Moctezuma's strategy of impressing the Spaniards with the awe and wonder of the Aztec civilization was finally having an impact. The treasure trove found in the chapel, the sights of human sacrifice, the whisperings of the Tlaxcalans, the realization that they were in the centre of this alien city, completely dependent on their hosts for food and water, and at the mercy of the Mexicans to be permitted on and off the island city via the bridges and causeways, all began to hit home. They began to see the city as a trap, and it was obvious how they would meet their end at the top of the great temple were they to be captured. However, if Moctezuma hoped the power and strength of the Aztec Empire would intimidate the Castilians into leaving, or at the very least preventing its demise, he had underestimated the situation that Cortes was in. His ships had been scuttled. It was conquer or die. Spanish fears were brought to a head by word from the Tlaxcalans that the Mexicans had instigated a rebellion against the garrison at Villarica, and that Moctezuma was planning to raise the bridges to the city. Cortes, showing amazing gumption, took a squad of armed soldiers and demanded to see the emperor. When granted an audience, he accused him of treachery and placed him under arrest. After some argument and protest, Moctezuma amazingly complied and was taken to the Castilian quarters back at his father's palace. The Aztec population were told that Moctezuma had merely taken up residence there, and Cortes allowed the normal functions of government to continue, albeit overseen by conquistadors and Dona Marina. Under the command of Cortes, Moctezuma ordered the governor of the region that had rebelled against Villarica to return to Tenochtitlan. When he arrived in mid-December, he and his entourage were arrested by Cortes, interrogated under torture, where they confessed, and implicated Moctezuma, before being burned at the stake in the great square, and with Moctezuma put in chains. Now it was time for the Aztec culture to be horrified at the actions of the Castilians. Moctezuma was fully in the shadow of Cortes, and even replaced the king of Texcoco with his brother when he heard that Texcoco was plotting an uprising against the conquistadors. We will return in a couple of weeks with part 2 of this great two-parter on the Spanish invasion and conquest of Mexico 1519 to 1521, written by Paul Seaman. Thanks again, Paul, for the script. It is a corker. If you want to find out about becoming a patron, you just go along to Patreon, that's patreon.com/The History Network, and you can find out all about our Patreon campaign there. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Paul Seaman, read by Nick Barker.